Let me, though, before closing, just give you one statistic which might give you an idea of how difficult the situation we're getting into is. All of you will remember, might have read some headlines about your present president's travel ban earlier this year. When was it? End of January this year? When the unilateral announcement of an 8-week suspension, 9-week suspension of travel into the US from 7 very unstable countries, all of which were Muslim majority. I'm sure here at your college, as everywhere in my country and everywhere in Europe, the reception of that policy was not warm, and that there was considerable criticism for the president for it. I would join some of that criticism, but what struck me in Europe as being most interesting was that 1 week after President Trump made that suggestion, attempted to see it in as policy, there was a poll released by the London-based think tank Chatham House, and they polled the public in 10 European countries. So this was, by this point, the year after the migration crisis had been at its height. And they asked the European publics a question far, far harder than anything that Donald Trump had proposed. They asked the European publics whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement that they didn't want one more Muslim in their country. 0 more Muslim immigration specifically. And the striking thing about this is that that poll from February 2016 showed that 8 out of 10 European countries polled, the majority of the public agreed with that statement. They agreed that they didn't want any more, 0 more Muslim immigration specifically. And the only 2 countries where that wasn't a majority opinion were my country, Britain, and Spain. And in Britain only, and I put it in quotation marks, only 47% of the public agreed with it. So one of the points of this book is to try to look at this very, very considerable problem and to try to look at it in the round and not to sugarcoat it or gloss it, but to make acknowledgement of the fact that a very strange thing has been happening in Europe, which I think has the potential to be fatal for all sorts of reasons. And if I could sum it up in a phrase, it would be this: that the events of recent years have been making the European publics stampede towards the right, to use a kind of gross left-right analogy, but bear with me. That the European publics have been stampeding to the right as a result of this. But the strange thing about it is that almost in response, their political leaders have been stampeding to the left. In other words, that the politicians are trying to run away from the public. And we can go into this, but that is just one of the reasons why I think there are going to be very, very difficult events in my continent in the years ahead. You'll notice, by the way, as a British person, I do still regard Europe as my continent, which is a maybe subject for Q&A.
You mentioned how, in your belief, that the European public is stampeding to the right while their leaders are stampeding to the left. I don't think if you look at the situation in Poland and Hungary, you have leaders stampeding to the right to the opposition of the general public to a certain extent. When you look at the example of European elections post-Brexit, you have leaders stampeding, partially, some leaders stampeding to the right in the form of Le Pen and Wilders, who were rejected by the electorate.
Let me just comment very quickly on your comment, as it were. I stressed that I was talking about Western Europe in that regard. I have a chapter in my book on the difference between East and Western Europe, which is, to my mind, fascinating. There is an absolutely central divide now between the Central and Eastern European states in Europe and the Western European states. I was in Hungary again a couple of weeks ago, and Orban has the support of 75% of the Hungarian public for saying we will not accept quotas of migrants from the EU that the EU has invited in, and we said no. And so there's a very interesting set of reasons, I think, why East and Western Europe have totally different views on this matter, among others. Secondly, the Le Pen-Wilders point, you're correct to some extent, but it's wrong to say that, as it were, they're totally defeated at the polls. Wilders' party came second in the Dutch elections, which still leaves him in the position very soon, if he could find a party to go into coalition with, that he can still get to power. And the other point is, as for Le Pen, look, if you want to make any job easier for a centrist European politician to continue the status quo, you can't do better than putting up as their opponent a member of the Le Pen family. You know, a family that's actually tainted by the Vichyite tendency in France. So, to my mind, again, it's like the one in Austria, you know, the presidential election last year. The non-far right-wing candidate wins by 51%, and everyone says, hurrah! Do you want to check those figures again and see how big a hurrah you want to give that?
I would just like to get your thoughts on a matter that hasn't been addressed today. Good. That being the European birth rate crisis. Yeah. And so I just wanted to ask you if you think that Europe must start accepting refugees in large quantities, refugees who often are young and come with families, and working immigrants to alleviate the oncoming labor shortage.
It's an important point. I have a chapter early on in my book where I say the 4 or 5 shoot-down arguments for why you need this migration. Every one of these arguments, it always comes up after the thing has already happened. They're always post-facto arguments. So after Germany opened the borders in 2015, there are German officials who say, we are an aging population and therefore we need... And I mean, there are so many ways to shoot this down, but the simplest is simply to observe the fact, amazing as it is, shocking as it is to a lot of European politicians, that immigrants get old as well. You know, an unheard of fact. And if you do believe that, first of all, you have to take that view, you have to believe that society should always have the same population level or always rise. So Britain is more than 60 million people now. It'll be 70 million within a decade or so. And that's just great, and there are no negative things. We should grow and grow and grow, like a business. I don't entirely, by any means, accept that argument, that a state has to always grow or always remain at exactly a static level. Sometimes populations go down, sometimes they go up. But if you did decide that you needed a population to remain stable, you would, among other things, find out how the population you have could have the number of children you needed to remain stable. So I went through all the social attitude surveys of British women in the period when immigration started to soar in the UK. Every single year shows the same thing, which is that women in Britain wanted the number of children that you would need to have a totally sustainable birth rate in the UK. So the question to me would be why the government doesn't look at this and say, okay, what is it that we're not doing right in terms of salaries, in terms of welfare, in terms of childcare? What are the things we're not doing that mean that women don't have the children that they want to have? But there's a whole pile of things you do before, as a German Chancellor, you decided that the next generation of Germans can be supported by the people of Eritrea, for instance, being brought in large numbers. So I find it one of a set of very strange, I say, post-facto justifications, which also, by the way, after all, has one other big, big underlying problem, which is if you go with that idea, you create a pyramid effect, which is that because everyone ages, you need to keep bringing in more and more people to keep everybody on the pyramid accustomed to the lifestyle that they've now taken to be their birthright. And this is a very, very hard model to sustain. But it's just one of, as I say, 3 or 4 reasons that are given, all of which come every single time down to one final one. And I've had this debate for years with European politicians from across the political spectrum. They say we need it because it makes us richer, And then if you prove that that's not the case, they say, well, it's because we're getting older. And then you prove that's not the case. And then they say, well, it makes us more diverse. And then you point out that that's not only good, it's also got some bad. And then they always come down to the final one, which is, it doesn't matter. It's going to happen anyway, so suck it up. And that final one, the welcome to globalization, is always said in a particular tone of voice to the public, which I wish they didn't do. It's almost impossible. When you're looking at political problems, things which the majority of the public are opposed to, which you keep telling them, we can't do anything, don't expect us to do anything, is just a terrible tone of voice to engage in politics. And I think that's a very regrettable place to be, but we are there. Yeah.